I've been looking forward to this because Maria and I don't know each other, and actually it was Trish who extended the invitation, and we're so glad that Trish did. Your background, just reading through your bio, is incredible. You're IFC, Amazon, CEO of Etsy. You worked at NPR. I mean, it's an eclectic mix,
it is indeed.
As well, right? .org.com. I guess what have you picked up along the way? I mean, some of these have become empires that you've been a part of, that you've helped build. What lessons have you learned?
Yeah, quite a few. Thank you. First of all, it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Trish.
Woo.
And I want to say I don't have anyone watching at home right now because my lovely husband has just arrived all the way from Philadelphia. Has come all the way from Philadelphia just to see this fireside chat. So, thank you, Mark.
You should do the interview.
Yeah, you're making me sound a little schizophrenic, but I'll try to put it together for you. I've done a number of things, and I've picked up a lot of lessons along the way, primarily from mistakes that I've made, but also from observing others. And oftentimes the others are founders, which is something I've never been. So I have a different perspective than most of you in the room, who I admire deeply and from whom I learned a lot today. But I'm that person who sometimes comes in and tries to work with all of you. And sometimes it works, and a lot of times, right? I'm that person who comes in, and oftentimes it doesn't work, but it's worked out once or twice for me. Some of the big lessons I've learned, Mike actually hit one right on the head, which is don't bring people into an organization or company if you really couldn't imagine yourself having dinner with them. I have made that mistake, and it just does not work. And I was talking earlier, we were talking, Kelly, with people and how that's always at the top. I know it's overused, it's trite, people say it all the time. The reason people say it all the time is because that's key. And it's not just the smartest people I've learned, it's the smartest people who fit with your values, who fit with your culture. And the other thing I've learned about culture, particularly in my startup experience, and this is a little different when you go into an organization that already has an established brand like NPR did, but culture in startups, so what is culture anyway when you're a 5 or 6 person organization? It's in my experience, and you all might have different experiences, but it's the behaviors of the founders, the founder or founders. And so one thing that I've observed is, for all of you founders, if you're thinking about culture and you think about it deliberately, you're doing yourself a great service. And if you really think about what kind of culture you want to have and what that means, what are the not just statement of values and so forth, but what kind of people embody that culture? And so I've been on a little bit on both sides of that, when it does work and when it doesn't work. And as a CEO, one couple big lessons too. One is that I was a first-time CEO when I became CEO of Etsy, and I hadn't really learned at that point how to manage or work with a board. And for those of you who are working with boards now, and I actually sit on several boards today, it's an interesting dynamic, especially if you have investors on your board. And so I learned a lot about that and made probably some good moves and some bad moves in that regard.
Can you tell us some of the ground level stories in terms of good moves, bad moves?
In any of those lessons, any of those categories?
Yeah. Let's go to the board dynamics.
Oh, the board dynamics. Yeah. Well, I think my main mistake, if you want to call it that, is as a first-time CEO. I didn't have a coach, or nobody sort of prepped me for what that was like. And I was coming from the last place I had been before Etsy was NPR, and NPR is a nonprofit organization, has a very complex governance. I was exposed to the board at NPR, but that's a whole different beast. And so I suddenly was the CEO of a startup company that at the time was tiny but was growing quickly, and had a board that had 2 pretty significant and well-known VCs on it, among others. And I think I didn't understand that it was kind of my job to manage them, and also that it was my job to develop the culture of the board. And I think while I had very good instincts as a business person, and I think that shows through in the performance of the company during the time that I was CEO, I think I didn't trust myself enough, and I kind of was too deferential to that board. And I think that's also relates to the fact that I wasn't a founder, and the founders were still in the business, which is almost an impossible dynamic. So if any of you are founders or not founders, if you want to read up on that topic, there's some really great writing by a guy named Noam Wasserman, who used to be a professor at Harvard, but he's moved somewhere else. I don't remember where, but he has some great writings and theories about that. And it's bottom line is it's sort of impossible to be that person who's trying to lead the company while the founders are still in the company. Only under exceptional circumstances has that worked. And people always cite Facebook, but really in that case, I would argue that they sort of have split the company into almost like co-CEO type arrangement, although Cheryl has the COO title.
And tell us a little bit about you working across these different organizations. You talked about culture and people being key, and that you made some really good decisions in terms of people and some really bad ones. Can you give us the highlight of both? And just one thing I want to mention is I love how open you are with sharing your failures or mistakes. And I think the bright spots, though, are just as important in terms of lessons. So when did culture really work, and when did it fail?
I think I'll use NPR as the time that it really worked. So just to set the stage, I know we have some people who aren't American here. So just really quickly, NPR is a media company. It used to stand for National Public Radio. It goes by NPR now because it's a multi-channel media company. Hopefully you use some of the products. It viewed itself, it has existed since 1970. It's a nonprofit, as I mentioned, and it's not a very big enterprise, about $180 million company today, but it has tremendous reach. So literally among the biggest audiences for radio in this country, for audio. So I stepped into it in 2001, and I was sort of the first digital leader. And I was coming from Amazon.com, so I was already completely internetized for several years prior to coming, and I sort of thought the whole world was already internetized. And I was very excited about coming to NPR because I had been a fan for a long time and it had played a big role in my personal development. So what I had to do was sort of figure out a way to build a team with few resources and to build something that actually wasn't welcomed by all because many people inside the institution saw it as a radio company. And there was some fear among some that if this thing called digital, which by the way has a screen and the rest of NPR doesn't, it's an audible experience only, that somehow if we were successful doing that would damage the brand. And so it was a tough job to sort of persuade people that in fact NPR is not a radio company, NPR is a storytelling company, and that stories can be told in different ways and in different media, and if we define ourselves by the medium only, then we'll probably be unsuccessful over time. So to get to your question there, I think the way that I was successful in building a team over time that delivered some really incredible products that survive today and serve millions of people is by first looking for people who had a passion for both what NPR does, because I wasn't going to have any equity to give them, no bonuses, reasonable salaries, but not going to make a ton of money. So they had to have a passion for what NPR does and to be able to express that and show that, but also to have functional expertise because, prior to all of this, there were no designers at NPR because it wasn't a visual medium, or there were no product people. In fact, that word kind of didn't exist in the lexicon. So it was about finding a combination of passion and functional expertise, and sort of being the little engine that could inside of the organization. And I think I was pretty good at identifying that and getting those people together. It wasn't without fail a couple of bad hires, but along the way. But that's what we became a very tightly knit group. And when we had one product success, we sort of got the wind at our back, and we were, the market was at our back too, because during my time we got, the development of mass broadband in the United States, we got social media development, we got the iPhone and smartphones, so all of that happened during that time, podcasting.
Yeah. And what, was going to ask you a little bit about Amazon, because you're there for all practical reasons, basically at the start. I mean, how?
Not quite, but early. Yeah.
But you left in 2001.
I left in 2001, and I went there. I was hired in '98, but I arrived in '99. Yeah.
And could you have predicted that Amazon would be the company that it is today?
No, I would be lying if I said I could predict that for sure. But I did pick Amazon. I was working in a completely different career prior. You mentioned I was working at an institution called IFC, which is part of the World Bank. And I sort of had gotten overtaken with enthusiasm and kind of, just incredible curiosity around what was happening with the commercialization of the internet at that time. And I singled out Amazon after studying it pretty carefully and raised my hand and said, hey, I'd like to work for you. So I couldn't have predicted the company that it has become, but the reason that I picked it, I think, is part of the reason why it's the company that it has become. It was a combination of, largely Bezos himself, and then also the way in which he was expressing what it was that he wanted to do. Yeah.
So Maria, this is my last question.
Okay.
Oftentimes mentors come to this program and you give so much to the entrepreneurs, but how can we help you? Like, what are you working on right now that you're excited about, where you could raise your hand and say, hey, I could use some support on this?
Yeah, I have a very specific ask in this regard. I'm actually working right now in New York City as an entrepreneur in residence at a startup studio called Redesign Health. And as the name implies, it's basically a studio that's trying to incubate companies in the healthcare arena, get them going, do seed investments in those companies, and then spin them out. And I've been brought in as a sort of beta test because the studio is relatively new. I think they're still trying to figure out how good ideas get generated. So I'm, sort of knocking around trying to think through some ideas that I have with the potential for starting something and actually putting myself in that chair that you all are in. So any wisdom that you have in that regard for someone like me who hasn't done that, it may not work. I'm always open to different outcomes, so I come into it with the mindset of I'd like to give this a try, but only if I can find a bankable idea or something that I think is a bankable idea. And in that regard, I'm actually my own worst enemy. So I generally think very few things are bankable, but so.
Yeah, well, you have come to the right community.
Yes, I have.
If you want perspective from an entrepreneur's vantage point and point of view. Maria, we are so excited to have you here, a part of the family. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.